Once again, in recent days, unspeakable acts of violence have held the attention of our nation. The most recent mass killing in Roseburg, Oregon, along with campus shootings on 2 of our university campuses, have renewed our national conversation about what can be done to prevent such atrocities from occurring in our nation with the regularity they seem to have achieved. We all have seen the graphs and depictions of how life in the United States is apparently more dangerous than in other developed nations in our world. We must consider deeply the reasons behind these sobering statistics. From the outset, let me be plain, this is not a sermon about gun violence. In the month when we raise awareness of domestic violence, this is not a sermon about domestic violence. In the month when we remember and mark the 17th anniversary of the murder of Matthew Shepard, this is not a sermon about violence against LGBTQ people. Yet it is a sermon about all of these, because it is a sermon with one purpose. That person is this: why are we, as human beings, why are we violent? And why do we act in violent ways against other human beings? It is not a political question. At its heart, it is a theological and spiritual question. When our ancient ancestors tried to explain violence, the story of Cain and Abel was offered as an explanation. The book of Genesis, as its title suggests, is a book about beginnings. The beginning of the earth, the beginning of people, the beginning of Israel. Lots and lots of beginnings. And tucked into this narrative is the story of the first act, the beginning act of violence. And we need to receive the story the way it is given to us and let go of our well-intentioned moralizing. 2 children are born to Adam and Eve. The first is Cain, whose name means to get or to create. The second is Abel, whose name means vapor or nothingness, without the possibility of life. Later, the New Testament writers will completely reverse those meanings, but this is the way the story was originally told. Cain is a farmer. Abel is a herdsman. At some point in the story's development, this was a story about conflict between farmers and shepherds and their relationship to God and to each other. The farmer and the cowman should be friends. But the story really isn't interested in these differences. At the very heart of the story is the fickle and apparently capricious nature of God. Both brothers offer sacrifice. Both worship. Both are sincere and earnest. Still, God chooses one sacrifice and rejects the other. Why? We don't know. And any answer we might offer is purely speculative and provisional. The informative question comes to Cain from God. Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain is not condemned. Rather, his sacrifice was not accepted. God's advice seems to be, let it go. Move on. Don't dwell on it. If you do well, you, not your sacrifice, you will be accepted. Cain is free and capable of living faithfully. And then in the very next breath, Cain is warned that sin is waiting like a hungry lion to leap. Sin is not about breaking rules. Sin is an aggressive force that is ready to ambush Cain. Sin is about to take on a life of its own, and the life it is about to take is Cain's. Sin is lusting for Cain, yearning for Cain, aching for Cain. Sin is about to tear apart Cain's life. Yet Cain is able to withstand it. You must master it, God speaks to Cain. The animal lusting for death and destruction can be ruled and can be controlled. It is not a suggestion, it is a commandment, a directive, a decree. If Cain is to be what God created all humankind to be, Cain and all like him must learn to control the urge to destroy. Cain and all like him must master the impulse that is ever present to harm and even kill another. Of course, we know what happened. Cain did not master that impulse to destroy. Through chicanery and deception, Cain lured his brother into the field, where Cain killed his brother, and the rest of the story is little more than the terms of an out-of-court settlement between God and Cain, in which Cain's life is spared, but in which he is left to wander the world without and beyond the presence of God. In short, Cain is sentenced to hell on earth. For many years, the conversations have been focused on violence, and they have asked the question, why are we violent? Some say that violence is instinctual, that it is the remnant of our animalistic past. There is no evidence to support that theory. In fact, when the argument is offered that we are violent by nature, it is usually offered so that we can establish that there is no real point in trying to change anything because we will always be that way. Some say that those in violent families inherit violence and violent behavior from their parents. Again, not one study has proven this to be true. In fact, studies have proven the exact opposite. Violence and violent behavior is not hereditary. Some have suggested that brain lesions are the cause of violence, that there is something physically wrong with the brains of violent people. Again, there is no evidence to support that theory. The American monk Thomas Merton suggested a far more challenging cause of our violence in these United States. He said nearly 50 years ago, the real focus of American violence is not in esoteric groups, but in the very culture itself, its mass media, its extreme individualism and competitiveness, its inflated myths of virility and toughness, and in its overwhelming preoccupation with the power of nuclear, chemical, bacteriological, and psychological overkill. How can we be surprised at finding violence in it? Can we get to the root of the trouble? For those of us in the Christian tradition, violence is, at its very heart and at its first instance, a spiritual issue. That does not absolve our leaders from doing everything within their capacity and power to reduce violence and ensure the public safety. That does not mean that we should not do everything in our power to curb the instances of domestic violence and to care for its victims. Nor does it mean that we should accept violence against LGBTQ people as simply the price they pay for being who they are. It does, however, challenge us to revisit and reclaim the life of faith to which Jesus called us long ago. We can no longer suspend our spirituality and vacate our values in favor of what the world around us seems to believe and treasure. We are, after all, people of faith whose principal figure was the victim of violence at the hands of those who rejected his message of love and peace. We are people who are challenged by our Lord with the words that ring with clarity and implication for this and every day. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? If the issue of violence is to be truly addressed, it can only be addressed when it is seen as a spiritual problem. And if the problem of violence is a spiritual problem, and I think you know by now that I think it is, then people of the Spirit must take the lead in addressing it. That means that the violence problem in America must become the work of American faith communities. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, Hindus, all of us working together must disavow violence and stand for the cause of peace. Together, we must condemn violence in every form and work together to eradicate violence in our communities. And that means that we must immediately cease our violent speech and actions against one another. We must immediately stand against the anti-Semitism and the anti-Islamic speech and action that fills our land. Because of the work we have already undertaken, Evansville can stand as a model for the nation in people of various faiths working together for the common good while building and enjoying friendships and partnerships that bring life and joy. Still, we must work beyond the confines of faith communities. People of faith, people like you and me, we must stand against bullying from the earliest stage of child development. We must speak and work to eliminate prejudice and discrimination. We must speak and work to challenge the stereotypes that deem some people successful and popular and valuable, while leaving those who cannot measure up to those stereotypes feeling that they are failures, disliked, and worthless. We must tone down the talk of individualism and learn to speak of community and working together. We must challenge ourselves to put away our obsession with self and the new narcissism of our time and begin seeing the deep needs of others for acceptance, compassion, and acknowledgement. If violence is at its heart a spiritual problem, then only people who can reclaim an authentic spirituality can help to solve it. Violence has been a spiritual problem from the beginning. It lies in wait for us, crouching like a lion, ready to pounce and consume us. We are not one bit different from Cain. But, and this is the good news, God reminds us that we can master it. We can control the desire to do violence. We have that power over the impulse to cease to do harm to ourselves and others. Now, if we as God's people want to decrease the violence in our world, then we'd better pay attention to what we have been doing that has caused its increase. What have we increasingly done over the past decades? We have forced more and more of our children and adults to be poor. We have neglected the hungry, the homeless, the uneducated, and the sick. We have widened the gap between rich and poor. We have shamed those with less than us and called them lazy, ungrateful, and unappreciative, as though they owe us some form of thanks. These are the very things that have led to our epidemic of violence. And Jesus had a lot to say about all of those contributing factors. We could cite chapter and verse, but let's just put it this way. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In love, there is no shame. In love, there is no want. In love, there is no neglect. In love, there is life and joy and peace, for now and evermore. Amen.